Jaden was only 7 years old, but he already carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. The streets of New York, with their bright lights and dark shadows, were his reality. While other children ran through parks, laughing and playing, he faced the challenges of a harsh and relentless life. The biting cold of nights spent without shelter, the incessant noise of the city that never sleeps, all of this was part of his daily routine. He walked along dirty sidewalks, his clothes always worn, trying to keep warm with old newspapers and finding some solace in the vague memories of a time when his life wasn't so difficult. Jaden's life was a constant struggle against hunger and fear. He sought refuge in forgotten corners of the city, where he could hide from the threats that surrounded him. At night, the eerie silence of the city was only broken by the hurried footsteps of strangers passing by, ignoring his presence. Jaden wondered if he would ever escape that nightmare, if there would be a place where he could finally feel safe. But the true terror did not come from the streets, it came from his own home. Monique, his mother, was not the refuge he had hoped for. On the contrary, she was a constant source of pain and suffering. In their small, dark, and claustrophobic apartment, Jaden was reminded daily that he was not welcome. Monique, bitter from life and frustrated by dreams that never came true, vented her anger on her son, as if he were to blame for everything that had gone wrong. Each insult, each blow, left deep marks on Jaden. He could not understand why his mother treated him with such cruelty. His large, innocent eyes, which once sparkled with hope, were now always filled with fear and distrust. Jaden shrank at every harsh word, at every look of contempt. He wondered, in his childlike mind, if there was something wrong with him, if somehow he deserved all that suffering. Nights were the worst. The heavy silence of the apartment was only interrupted by Monique's screams, echoing through the corridors. Jaden tried to hide under the covers, but nothing could protect him from the despair that surrounded him. He wondered if his life would ever be different, if one day he could have a mother who truly loved him. But these thoughts were quickly replaced by the fear of what might happen next. And so, Jaden continued his silent struggle, surviving day by day, always hoping that things might get better, even if he didn't know how. What he didn't realize was that this hope, however fragile, would keep him strong to face the challenges yet to come. For, deep down, Jaden was a survivor, even if he didn't perceive it. Hello, my friends. I'm here to ask a big favor of you. If you enjoy the videos on our channel, please subscribe and help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers this month. Subscribe and help us make this dream come true. Thank you so much, and let's continue with the video. As each day passed, Jaden saw his mother sink deeper into a spiral of frustration and bitterness. Monique, who once dreamed of a life full of possibilities, was now trapped in a reality that suffocated her. Her once bright and ambitious dreams had become just distant memories, shadows of a life she never managed to achieve. And slowly, she began to believe that Jaden was responsible for all the suffering she faced. To Monique, Jaden was more than just a child, he was the reflection of all the lost opportunities, of all the closed doors. Every time she looked at him, she felt a growing rage, a pain that consumed her from within. In Monique's mind, Jaden was the reason her life had not followed the path she so desired. And so, day after day, she vented her frustration on her son, as if that could somehow ease the pain she carried. Monique's words were sharp as blades, cutting deep into Jaden's heart. She accused him of ruining her dreams, of destroying the chance for a better life. "If it weren't for you, I could have been someone," she yelled, not realizing how much her words hurt. Jaden, with his sad eyes and already wounded soul, absorbed each of these accusations, not understanding why he was treated with such hatred. Monique, in turn, sank deeper into an abyss of resentment. She remembered how she was once young and full of life, how she believed the world was at her feet. But now, when she looked at Jaden, all she saw was a life she did not want, an existence that felt unbearable. And in her mind, distorted by pain, Jaden became the symbol of all her disappointments. The nights were long and dark, both for Jaden and Monique. While he struggled to understand what he had done wrong, she brooded over every decision, every moment when she felt life slipping through her fingers. In her despair, Monique plunged into dark thoughts, wondering if she would ever escape that oppressive reality. And, unknowingly, she continued to destroy the fragile hope that Jaden still tried to keep alive. The relationship between mother and son deteriorated further, a vicious cycle of guilt and pain. Monique, unable to deal with her own demons, projected everything onto Jaden, not realizing that, in doing so, she was creating deep scars in his heart. But despite everything, Jaden still found strength to survive, even if he didn't know how. Because, deep down, he believed there was still something good for him, even if it was hidden in the shadows of his life. The weight of guilt and anger became unbearable for Monique. Each day was a struggle between the love she once felt for her son and the hatred that now consumed her heart. She could not escape the bitter memories of a life that had slipped out of her control, and Jaden, in her eyes, had become the symbol of everything that had gone wrong. In her despair, she began to contemplate something unthinkable, something that gnawed at her inside, but seemed to be the only solution to her growing pain. Monique found herself increasingly trapped in a cycle of dark thoughts. The words that had once been spoken in anger began to take on a new meaning in her troubled mind. Maybe it would be better for him, she thought, trying to justify to herself what was becoming an increasingly inevitable decision. It was as if a shadow was forming within her, obscuring any trace of love that might still exist. The final decision came on a cold night, where the silence of the apartment seemed to amplify each of her tortured thoughts. Monique, tired of fighting against herself, decided she could no longer continue. The guilt was consuming her, and in her despair, she convinced herself that abandoning Jaden would be an act of mercy. "He'll be better off without me," she repeated in her mind, trying to believe it. The pain of making this decision was almost unbearable, but at the same time, it seemed to be the only way to escape the suffocating reality. That night, Monique did what she never imagined she was capable of. She waited until Jaden was asleep, his soft and innocent breathing piercing her like a knife. She slowly got up, her heart pounding heavily in her chest. She packed some of her clothes into a bag, took the little money she had, and headed for the door. Each step felt like a ton of weight, as if the ground was trying to hold her back, begging her to change her mind. But Monique did not look back. She could not. If she did, she knew her fragile plan would crumble. She left the key on the dining table, a simple gesture that carried immense emotional weight. As she crossed the threshold, Monique closed her eyes for a moment, trying to block out the pain she felt. "It's for the best for him," she repeated to herself, like a mantra. And with one last sigh, she stepped out, leaving Jaden alone in the world. The door closed softly behind her, sealing the fate of both. For Jaden, that morning would bring the painful discovery that he was truly alone. Upon waking and realizing his mother was not there, a void filled his heart. He didn't know what to do, where to go, or how to survive without her, despite all the suffering she had caused him. Monique had left, taking not only her belongings but also the last spark of hope Jaden held in his chest. And at that moment, his life changed forever. The days after Monique's abandonment were cruel for Jaden. He wandered the streets of New York, now truly alone, without a place to call home. The biting cold, the constant hunger, all blended into an endless nightmare. Every face in the crowd was unknown, every shadow seemed a threat. But Jaden, small and fragile as he was, refused to give up. He clung to any sign of hope, any gesture of kindness he found along the way, trying to survive one day at a time. It was on one of those nights, when despair seemed about to swallow him whole, that Jaden's life took an unexpected turn. While he sheltered under a marquee, curled against the biting wind, a woman approached. Her name was Margaret, and she seemed different from the other people who passed by without noticing the boy's presence. There was something warm in her voice, something that made Jaden feel, for a brief moment, safe. "Are you alone, dear?" she asked, her voice sweet as honey. Jaden, tired and scared, merely nodded, lacking the strength to speak. Margaret seemed a savior sent by some miracle. She offered Jaden a home, a place where he wouldn't have to worry about cold or hunger anymore. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of hope ignite in his heart. Margaret took him to her house, a place that felt welcoming and safe, far from the relentless streets of New York. Jaden, though still suspicious, began to believe that perhaps his luck had finally changed. However, he would soon realize that things are not always as they seem. The warmth of Margaret's home hid dark secrets, and the kindness she displayed was merely a facade. Jaden began to notice that the promises of safety and comfort came at too high a price. Margaret was not the savior he had imagined. Gradually, he discovered that there were other children like him in the house, all trapped in a web of lies and manipulation. They were not free, but captives in a cruel game that Margaret played in the shadows. The reality of the situation became clear to Jaden when Margaret began to demand something in return for her kindness. He was forced to work, to obey orders that made no sense to him, all under the threat of losing the little he had received. The house, which had once seemed a refuge, was now an invisible prison. Jaden, though still not fully understanding what was happening, felt that something was terribly wrong. And in his heart, fear began to transform into determination. He knew he needed to escape. Life on the streets had taught Jaden how to survive, to never give up, and now, more than ever, he needed all the courage he had. Margaret, with her false smiles and empty promises, was not the salvation he sought. And so, as he planned his escape, Jaden began to prepare for the fight of his life. Because, even surrounded by darkness, he still believed there was a light somewhere, waiting for him. As the days passed, Margaret's house became increasingly oppressive. What had once seemed a refuge now revealed its true face, a disguised cage. Jaden, who had already faced the harshness of the streets, now found himself trapped in a new form of torment. Margaret, with her sweet smile and soothing words, controlled every aspect of his life. Every movement, every breath of freedom was carefully monitored, as if he were a puppet in the hands of his false savior. The work that Margaret imposed on Jaden was heavy and endless. From dawn until dusk, he was forced to perform exhausting tasks, with no rest or relief. She kept him busy, always under the promise that if he behaved well, things could improve. But deep down, Jaden knew those promises were empty, echoing like the distant sound of an impossible dream. Each day was a painful repetition of the last, and each night he lay down exhausted, his body aching, but his mind always alert, planning a way to escape. The other children living in the house shared the same fate. Their faces were shadows, eyes empty, and bodies that had learned to endure the unbearable. No one dared to speak out loud about what really happened there. Fear was etched on every face, and Jaden could see the same anguish in their eyes that he felt in his own heart. The house was filled with shattered lives, all kept under the iron fist of Margaret, a woman who knew how to maintain appearances, but whose heart was made of ice. Margaret used manipulation as her main weapon. She knew how to make Jaden feel small, worthless, as if he had no choice but to obey her. She said that the world outside was dangerous, that he wouldn't survive without her. And although Jaden knew the streets were cruel, there was something even more terrifying about that house. The truth was that even amidst the chaos of the city, he still felt he had some chance, a small spark of freedom. But there, in Margaret's house, he was a prisoner in every sense. Yet, Jaden refused to be broken. Even under constant surveillance, he began to observe, to learn Margaret's patterns, to notice the moments when she let her guard down. The strength he had accumulated on the streets now transformed into a silent strategy for survival. He knew he could not afford to lose hope, for hope was the only thing that no one could take from him. And so, he began to plan his escape, with the same determination that had kept him alive until now. Each day, Jaden mentally prepared for the right moment. He knew he couldn't just run away, he had to be careful, quick, and above all, brave. Margaret might have built a cage around him, but she could not imprison his will to be free. And as the days dragged on, Jaden kept his eyes fixed on a single goal, to escape that nightmare and finally find the freedom he so desperately desired. Because, deep down in his being, he knew he deserved more than that life, and he was willing to fight for it. Jaden spent weeks planning his escape, each detail carefully analyzed in his young, yet experienced mind. He knew he would only have one chance, and any mistake could cost him the freedom he longed for. The nights were long and full of thoughts, as he mentally prepared for the day he would finally leave that house behind. The tension grew with each passing day, but along with it, so did his determination. Jaden was no longer the scared boy who had been found on the streets. He was now someone who knew he could rely on no one but himself. The opportunity finally arose on a spring afternoon when Margaret's vigilance was slightly weakened. She was busy with another child, and Jaden sensed the perfect moment. With his heart racing in his chest, he acted quickly. He grabbed the backpack he had secretly prepared, containing only the essentials, a few clothes, a piece of stale bread, and the determination to survive. He moved cautiously, every step measured, trying not to make any sound that could alert his captor. As he slipped out the back door, Jaden felt the fresh air on his face like a breath of freedom. The sensation was both terrifying and invigorating. Every second outside that house felt surreal, as if he were living a dream from which he could awaken at any moment. But he knew he couldn't stop, couldn't afford to hesitate. Running through the streets that once had welcomed him with indifference, he found himself back in that immense and relentless world, but this time with a clear purpose, to flee and never look back. Jaden's escape was not easy. He found himself running through dark alleys, dodging curious glances, trying to blend in with the crowd. His mind was in high alert, every sound, every movement felt like a threat. But inside him, there was a flame of courage pushing him forward. He didn't know where he was going, but anywhere was better than the prison he had left behind. The city, with all its dangers, was a challenge he was willing to face head-on. Finally, after what felt like hours of running, Jaden spotted a small police station. His exhausted body begged for rest, but his mind was focused on a single thing, asking for help. He entered the building hesitantly, his steps slow and cautious. Upon seeing the police officers, he felt a mix of relief and fear. He didn't know if he could trust adults, but at that moment, he had no other choice. He approached the counter, and with a trembling voice, recounted his story. The officer's expressions shifted from skepticism to concern as Jaden described the horrors he had lived through. Finally, he was being heard. His escape, more than an act of courage, was a cry for justice. And in that moment, Jaden knew that despite everything he had been through, he had taken the first step to reclaim his freedom and, perhaps, begin to forge a new path. The escape was not the end of his journey, but the beginning of a fight for a better life, far from the shadows that had imprisoned him. The courtroom was large and imposing, its high walls seemed to engulf Jaden, who felt tiny amidst so many curious and suspicious gazes. He had never been in a place like that before, but at the same time, he felt that somehow, his destiny had brought him there. The memories of the days spent in Margaret's house still haunted his mind, but Jaden knew he needed to be strong. This wasn't just about his freedom, it was about all the children, like him, who were trapped in that nightmare. He needed to make his voice heard. Judge Phillips was a man of few words, but his eyes showed a wisdom acquired over years of witnessing the best and worst of humanity. When Jaden entered the room, he immediately sensed something different about the boy. Something in Jaden's eyes made him stop and pay attention. There was pain there, yes, but also an unusual strength for someone so young. Jaden, gathering all the courage he could muster, told his story. The words came from his mouth with difficulty, as if each one carried the weight of all the suffering he had endured. As Jaden spoke, the room, once so cold and indifferent, began to transform. The murmurs ceased, and the looks of distrust gave way to expressions of shock and compassion. It was as if, at that moment, everyone present was experiencing the pain that Jaden carried within him. Judge Phillips listened attentively, absorbing every detail with care. He had seen many things in his career, but the boy's story was different. There was something in the way Jaden recounted his torment that touched the hearts of everyone there. As Jaden recounted the horrors he faced at the hands of Margaret, the silence in the room became heavy, almost palpable. No one dared to interrupt. Jaden's words were like cutting blades, exposing the cruel reality he had lived. And as his story unfolded, Judge Phillips began to feel a mix of indignation and determination rising within him. He knew he could not let this injustice go unnoticed. Something needed to be done, and quickly. When Jaden finished speaking, the room remained silent for a moment that felt eternal. Judge Phillips, now with his eyes fixed on the boy, leaned forward in his seat. He felt that this was not just another case, it was a chance to change something, to make a difference in Jaden's life and in the lives of other children who might be suffering in the shadows. In a firm tone, he announced that an investigation would be initiated immediately. The judge's words echoed through the room like a promise, a guarantee that justice would finally be served. Jaden, who until then felt like a leaf in the wind, began to realize that for the first time in a long time, he was not alone. He had been heard, and not only that, he had managed to touch the hearts of those who had the power to change his life. That courtroom, which at first seemed daunting and impenetrable, was now becoming the stage for a new hope. Jaden knew that the fight was not over, but at that moment, he felt he had taken the most important step of all, to reclaim his dignity and his right to be free. After Jaden's testimony, the wheels of justice began to turn with a force he could never have imagined. Judge Phillips, moved by the intensity of the boy's story, ordered that the investigations be conducted urgently. The usual coldness of the courtroom gave way to a renewed sense of purpose. Everyone involved in that case felt that it was not just another process, but a real chance to make a difference, to protect those who could not defend themselves. The investigations revealed a dark and terrifying world hidden behind the tranquil facade of Margaret's house. Law enforcement agents, accompanied by social workers, stormed the place on a gray morning, ready to confront whatever they might find. Margaret, who had felt untouchable for so long, was caught off guard. Her confidence crumbled the moment the doors were kicked in and her true nature was exposed. The house, which once seemed a safe refuge, was now becoming the epicenter of a rescue operation. The children, including those Jaden had only seen as shadows in dark hallways, were finally freed from their captivity. Each face reflected a mixture of fear and relief, a silent acknowledgement that despite everything, someone had fought for them. The authorities, careful in every move, ensured that each child was welcomed and protected, far from Margaret's reach. For Jaden, knowing that his story had triggered that action was like a balm for his wounds. He had done the right thing, and that filled his heart with a hope he had not felt in a long time. Margaret was taken into custody, her attempts to justify herself quickly silenced by the overwhelming evidence against her. She, who had so often manipulated and controlled, now found herself powerless, stripped of the authority she had wielded over those innocents. The trial was swift and relentless, with Judge Phillips presiding with the same seriousness he had shown from the beginning. Each testimony, every piece of evidence presented, reinforced the gravity of the crimes committed. Margaret was no longer the figure of authority she once seemed to be. Now, she was just a woman shattered by the weight of her own actions. For Jaden, the rescue of the other children was a moment of silent victory. He had survived, yes, but more than that, he had become the catalyst for the freedom of so many others. It wasn't just his story that was being rewritten, but that of all those who had suffered in silence. The dark, fear-filled nights in Margaret's house began to seem more distant, almost like a nightmare he was finally waking up from. Jaden was no longer just a survivor, he was someone who, with his courage, had changed the course of many lives. However, Jaden knew that despite the justice being served, his journey was far from over. The scars, both physical and emotional, would remain with him, constantly reminding him of what he had endured. But now, with Margaret imprisoned and the children safe, he could begin to look to the future with a new perspective. He had regained something that Margaret and life on the streets had almost completely taken from him: hope. And with that hope, Jaden was ready to face whatever came next, knowing he had achieved the most important thing of all: freedom. Despite everything he had gained, Jaden knew that an important chapter of his story had yet to be closed. His mother's name, Monique, echoed in his mind like a persistent ghost. He had fought to escape the pain and abandonment she had caused him, but the resentment and unanswered questions continued to haunt him. Why did she abandon him? What led her to make such a cruel decision? These questions burned in his soul, and Jaden knew that to move forward, he needed to confront that painful past. When the authorities finally located Monique, Jaden felt a mix of relief and apprehension. She had been found living in a small apartment, alone, distanced from the world she once dreamed of conquering. The meeting between mother and son was set, and Jaden, now more mature and strong, prepared to face that woman who, at one time, had been everything he knew. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew he couldn't let the unspoken words continue to eat away at his spirit. The day of the reunion was wrapped in a silent tension. Upon entering the apartment, Jaden saw Monique sitting in an old rocking chair, with a distant gaze, almost as if she were waiting for that moment. Time had marked her, just as it had him. Her face was older, and the bitterness that once defined her seemed to have given way to a deep emptiness. When their eyes finally met, Jaden felt a mix of emotions he couldn't name. There was anger, yes, but there was also sadness and, strangely, a trace of compassion. Monique, for her part, barely recognized the young man before her. Jaden had grown, both physically and emotionally, and the boy she had abandoned was no longer there. The weight of abandonment seemed to rest on her as well, and although words were hard to find, Monique began to explain her reasons. She spoke of the fears she felt, how her own life had crumbled in a series of wrong decisions. Amid the chaos of her own existence, she simply couldn't see Jaden as someone she could protect. To her, abandonment seemed to be the only possible choice, even though she now recognized how much she had failed as a mother. Monique's explanations did not bring the immediate peace Jaden had hoped for. In fact, they opened new wounds, reminding him of how much he had suffered because of her choices. But at the same time, he could see that Monique was also trapped by her own demons, unable to cope with the pain and guilt that had haunted her for all those years. The silence between them became heavy, each trying to find a way to move forward without being consumed by the past. Jaden knew that the answers Monique gave him would not erase what he had lived through. But looking into her eyes, he also understood that forgiveness was not about justifying what had happened, but about freeing oneself. The weight of anger he had been carrying began to slowly dissipate, and he made the decision that he would no longer let abandonment define who he was. Monique, for all her failings, was just a part of his story, and Jaden was determined to write the rest of it on his own terms. The reunion between mother and son did not bring about a miraculous reconciliation. There were no tears of joy or warm embraces. What there was a silent acceptance that the past could not be changed, but the future was still open to both of them. Jaden left that apartment knowing he had faced the most painful ghost of his life, and although there was, Jaden had always dreamed of finding a place where he could finally feel safe, loved, and part of something greater than his own pain. After everything he had faced, it seemed almost impossible to believe that such a place existed. But life, with its unexpected turns, brought him new hope, a new chance to start over. It was during one of the court hearings that he met his biological father's parents, people he hadn't even known existed until that moment. They had been located by a social worker who, while investigating Jaden's past, discovered that his paternal grandparents, Robert and Helen, were completely unaware of their grandson's existence. When they learned about Jaden's story, something within them awakened, an urgency to fix what had been broken, even if it was not directly their fault. The first meeting between Jaden and his grandparents was marked by a silence filled with contained emotion. They, who had lost their son many years before, now saw in Jaden a part of him, a continuation they hadn't known they had. Jaden, with his heart still full of scars, initially didn't know how to react to the presence of those strangers who suddenly wanted to be part of his life. He had learned to protect himself, to keep people at a distance, but there was something in the way Robert and Helen looked at him that disarmed him. It was a gaze of tenderness, of understanding, as if they could see beyond the barriers he had erected. Slowly, they began to build a relationship based on trust and, above all, respect for what Jaden had lived through. Days turned into weeks, and Jaden began to allow himself to feel something he had long suppressed, the feeling of belonging. Robert and Helen didn't try to fill the void left by Jaden's parents, but instead offered him something new, something he didn't expect to find so late in his young life. They invited him to live with them, to know the house where his father had grown up, to become part of a family that, though marked by loss, still had enough love to welcome him with open arms. His grandparents' house, situated in a quiet neighborhood, was different from anything Jaden had ever known. There was a calmness there, a peace that contrasted sharply with the turbulence of his past. Each room seemed to tell a story, each object held a special meaning, a memory linked to someone he barely knew, but who was now part of who he was. Robert taught him how to take care of the garden, to plant and watch things grow, a silent metaphor for Jaden's own life. Helen surrounded him with her quiet affection, always attentive to his needs, never pressuring him to be something he was not. With time, Jaden began to feel that the house was more than just a physical place, it was a home. A place where he could be himself, without fear of judgment or abandonment. Each day spent with his grandparents was a small victory over the past, a slow but steady construction of a future that he began to see with hope. Robert and Helen, in turn, saw in Jaden a new opportunity to love, to continue their son's legacy, transforming the pain of loss into something beautiful and meaningful. And so, Jaden, who had spent so long feeling lost, found his way back to a life he never imagined was possible. With his grandparents, he discovered that true love doesn't have to be perfect, but rather constant, present in every gesture, in every word of encouragement. He still carried the marks of his past, but now those marks were part of a bigger story, a story that was far from over. Jaden had found the home he had long sought, and with it, the chance to finally live the life he always deserved. As time went by, Jaden began to understand what it truly meant to have a family. His grandparents, Robert and Helen, not only provided him with a roof over his head and food on the table, but also something he had never truly experienced, unconditional love. It was a love that demanded nothing in return, that wasn't tied to rules or impossible expectations. It was simply the kind of love that allowed Jaden to be who he was, with all his flaws and scars. And it was in that nurturing environment that he began to heal the deep wounds he had carried for so long. Robert, with his infinite patience, began to teach Jaden simple things that carried immense meaning. They spent hours together in the garden, planting flowers, mowing the grass, or just talking. The comfortable silence between them often spoke more than any words could. It was as if, without needing to explain, they both understood the value of each moment, of each small victory over the past. The earth they cultivated together was not just a garden, but a symbol of the new life Jaden was building, day by day. Helen, in her own subtle ways, demonstrated her love, always present but never overwhelming. She left loving notes on the breakfast table, cooked Jaden's favorite meals, and listened attentively whenever he felt the need to talk. She never pressured him, never demanded that he share more than he was ready to offer. Instead, Helen was always there, a constant and tranquil presence that Jaden knew he could trust. Gradually, he began to open up more, sharing his memories, his pain, and also his dreams, which had once seemed so distant. With his grandparents' support, Jaden began to rebuild his life in other aspects as well. He returned to school, something he had left behind amidst the chaos of his childhood. School, which had once seemed an intimidating and unreachable place, was now becoming a space of possibilities. His grandparents encouraged him to move forward, not to give up, and fueled by this new sense of belonging, Jaden began to believe that he could indeed have a different, better future. Studies that had once felt like a burden now became a path for him to discover new passions and talents. With each passing day, Jaden felt stronger, more capable of facing the world, not as a victim of his past, but as someone who had overcome unimaginable challenges and emerged stronger on the other side. He realized that true healing did not lie in forgetting what had happened, but in learning to live with the scars and transforming pain into wisdom and strength. And with Robert and Helen by his side, he knew that no matter what the future held, he would have a solid foundation to rely on. However, the greatest lesson Jaden learned from his grandparents was about the power of love and family. It wasn't blood that bound them, but rather the shared experiences, the trust built, and the mutual desire to create something beautiful out of what was once only suffering. With every smile they exchanged, every silent hug, Jaden felt he was finally becoming the person he had always been meant to be. He was no longer the lost boy on the streets or the prisoner of Margaret. Now, he was Jaden, Robert and Helen's grandson, part of a family that loved him for who he was, not for who they expected him to be. And that, more than anything else, was the healing he so desperately needed. As the months passed, Jaden began to realize that the peace and security he had found with his grandparents were just the beginning of something greater. Life, which had once been a constant battle for survival, was now offering him a new perspective that he was worthy of love and protection. But more than that, he finally allowed himself to feel something he had long denied: happiness. A simple happiness that came from the little things in everyday life, but that was, for him, as grand as any dream he had ever had. The smiles that now blossomed on his face were no longer forced or rare. They came naturally, whether waking up to the smell of coffee made by Helen or listening to Robert's old stories, filled with wisdom and warmth. Jaden not only found a home but also a purpose. He began to understand that his past, no matter how painful, did not define who he was or who he could become. And by accepting this, he opened space for the love he had always deserved but had been denied for so long. One day, while walking through the garden that he and Robert had lovingly tended, Jaden paused for a moment and looked around. The wind gently swayed the trees, and the late afternoon sun illuminated everything with a golden, almost magical light. It was there, in that moment, that he realized how much he had changed, how much he had grown. The journey that brought him here was filled with pain and challenges, but also discoveries and triumphs. And now, finally, he could say that he was at peace with himself and the world around him. His grandparents, who had welcomed him with open arms, were the anchor he so desperately needed. With them, Jaden not only found a home but also the unconditional love that supported him day after day. Every gesture, every word of affection, every piece of advice, everything was proof that he, despite everything, was worthy of happiness. And this happiness, which once seemed so distant, was now present in every detail of his new life. He knew that no matter what the future held, he was prepared because he had people by his side who truly loved him. The love that Jaden finally found with his grandparents was the kind of love that heals, that strengthens, that gives meaning to life. And it was this love that helped him reconnect with the world, to see beauty in simple things, to believe in dreams once again. Jaden knew that, no matter how difficult his journey had been, he had arrived where he needed to be. He was no longer the lost and hurt boy on the streets of New York. Now, he was part of something greater, part of a family that valued and respected him for who he was. And so, Jaden, with his heart finally at peace, embraced the life he had always desired. He knew that. And then, what is your story? How many times have you asked yourself if you truly deserve to be happy, if you deserve to find the love and peace you've always dreamed of? Jaden's story shows us that no matter how tough the challenges we face, there is always a chance to start over, to find what we have been seeking. But, are you willing to take that first step towards change? Are you ready to leave behind the pains of the past and embrace a future full of possibilities? Think for a moment. What is holding you back from achieving the life you deserve? Is it fear, doubt, or simply a lack of support? Remember, the journey may be tough, but just like Jaden, you can find strength where you least expect it. And believe me, you deserve all the good that life has to offer. So, why not start now? Why not take the first step to transform your life and find the happiness you've always wanted? If this story touched your heart, if you saw yourself reflected in it at any moment, then I invite you to continue this journey with us. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and don't miss any of our upcoming videos. We are here to inspire you, motivate you, and remind you that it's never too late to change. And before you go, take a look at the videos appearing on the screen now. Each of them carries a powerful message, ready to help you take the next step in your own story. Let's walk together on this path of transformation and growth. Are you ready?